Blackburn, interviews editor at the Oxford Blue, and I'm here today to interview Tim Harford, an economist, journalist, and writer who has had a varied career working for the BBC and the Financial Times, among others. So, Tim, I'd like to begin, if I may, by discussing your role as an economics communicator. So, you've written several books, most notably The Undercover Economist, which aims to introduce the reader to basic economics concepts, and these have been extremely popular. What would you say is the secret to your success on this front?
Well, thank you. I would say you say Undercover Economist is the most notable, but I always like to talk about the recent one as well, How to Make the World Add Up. I think the Sunday Times just said it was one of the top 10 business bestsellers of 2020. So let's not forget that one as well. But why did the Undercover Economist take off? I wish I knew. It was very unpredictable. When I wrote the book, I didn't have a publisher, I didn't have an agent, I didn't have any reason to believe anybody would read it. And an awful lot of people did. I think that one of the things that appealed was my sense of curiosity about the world. The way that book worked was I would wander around looking at things and going, huh, that's interesting. That reminds me of something I learned in economics class. Or I wonder why that is the way it is. And a lot of the structure of the book comes from that sort of starting point. And I think people find that curiosity infectious in a way that I think I didn't really understand at the time, but I maybe understand a little bit more now why that is. And perhaps I should have realized it all along, but I stumbled into something that worked, and I was very lucky.
Absolutely, yeah. But you have this incredible way of making some very complicated economic concepts seem incredibly approachable, suddenly concepts which I've struggled with since I came to uni. So how do you go about doing that sort of very approachable writing?
Well, there are a couple of different ways to do it. I mean, you have to try and understand it yourself, which is not always easy. But I suppose I understand things that I find interesting and trust that if I find them interesting, other people will find them interesting, and helping people to understand what is interesting about it and why it matters, I think, is useful for any concept. The other trick that I use a lot, trick maybe is a slightly unfair word, but the other thing that I do a lot is to tell stories, and increasingly so, less so actually in Undercover Economist and more in my more recent books. But I find that a really interesting craft as a writer, to tell a story, to talk about protagonists, to have a character arc, to have plot twists, like a proper story, not just an anecdote, not just an example, but a proper story. That is really fun to writer, really to read when the stories work. And we humans are built to listen to stories. We're built to understand stories. There is psychological research into this sort of thing. You can pick up a lot more information and remember a lot more information if it comes in the form of a story rather than in a non-narrative way of conveying the same information. So those are things that I try and do.
Right. So whilst we're talking about the sort of narratives in your recent works, I'd quite like to talk about your more recent podcast, Cautionary Tales. So for those who don't know, Cautionary Tales is a podcast you started in 2019 and released a new series in 2020. Is that correct?
Yeah, the first series was 8 episodes, came out in late 2019. Then we had a sort of emergency lockdown mini-series in the summer of 2020, slightly shorter episodes, just 6 of them, reflecting on the cautionary tales were all something in one way or another to do with not seeing problems coming or something to do with the pandemic. And I'm working now on the second full series, which is it's a mammoth series. It's going to be 14 episodes, and it will be out in late February 2021. So a lot of them are already recorded. Yeah, and that's the timing of it. Cautionary Tales is a podcast about things going wrong. So some about fiascos, sometimes it's about tragedies and catastrophes. And in each case, the idea is to tell the story, but also learn the lessons and to draw on social science, to draw on thinking from safety engineering or sociology or psychology or statistics or economics, rigorous academic ideas to help explain why what happened and why it probably wasn't a one-off. And these are lessons that we should be learning for our own good. So, for example, one of the first cautionary tales was about an oil tanker heading towards rocks that were perfectly visible on every chart, perfectly good weather. And this oil tanker just went on and on and on towards the rocks just off the coast of Cornwall. This all happened in 1967. And it was an environmental disaster, one of the first environmental disasters involving a tanker crash. But the question is, why didn't he turn? And the simple answer is he got himself into a situation where he wasn't able to rethink his plan. And this turns out to be very common. You come up with a plan, you're like, this is what we're going to do, and information comes in that says you should rethink, turn around, and we don't, because perversely the very fact that the pressure's on, that new information is coming in, you start to get real tunnel vision. You're under such pressure that you can't take in new information. I'm having this conversation on Tuesday, the 5th of January. On last night, Boris Johnson went on television and announced that all the schools had to close, having the day before told all the schools to open. It was the Christmas holidays. Open all the schools, send all the kids to schools, and within hours, he's like, actually, I've changed my mind. That to me it's the same thing as the guy who his name was Pastrengo Rajati, the captain who steered his oil tanker onto the rocks. This is a story about not being able to take on board new information because you just can't bear to abandon the plan that seemed to you to be such a good idea.
I'd like to get on to talking about the coronavirus pandemic in more detail a bit later on. But for now, back in the halcyon days of 2019, before everything went so terribly wrong, where did the idea for this sort of podcast, which has become increasingly relevant, where did it originally come from?
Well, Malcolm Gladwell and Jacob Weisberg are the founders of Pushkin, which is the podcast studio that produces cautionary tales. And they said, we'd love to have you do some podcasts, do whatever you want, really, that pitch us an idea. And cautionary tales came to mind because I've long been interested in errors. My third book was Adapt. That's back in 2012, which is all about making mistakes and learning from mistakes and the importance of experimentation and mistakes in innovation and in problem solving. So I've been interested in errors for a long time, but they just seemed a great format for a podcast because they're, well, let's just, if you're interested in stories of things going wrong are a lot more compelling than stories of things going right. And since I think the social behind error is interesting, safety engineering is interesting, behavioral economics is interesting, psychology is interesting. I mean, errors are fascinating anyway. When you add the storytelling component in, it just seemed like a very rich theme to mine. And it turns out, I mean, we're, as I say, what are we now? We're about to go up to 28 episodes, I guess. So 28 episodes in, and we haven't run out of mistakes yet, and I suspect we won't.
Well, personally, I find your cautionary tales extremely compelling, and I'd thoroughly recommend them to our readers. But do you find there's any, I know you deal with different mistakes in every episode, but do you find there's any particular mistake cropping up time and time again that we need to learn from?
You certainly find that often things don't go wrong for one reason, and they will go wrong for several reasons, and then partly the cautionary tale is about choosing what to focus on. So you will sometimes say, okay, well, the I'm writing one about the Charge of the Light Brigade, and one of the issues in the Charge of the Light Brigade is a reluctance to challenge authority. Well, arguably the same thing. Sociologists sometimes describe it as power distance. You could say the same thing was true on the bridge of Torrey Canyon, the oil tanker that crashed. There were people on the bridge who could see the captain was making a mistake and were reluctant to tell him that he was making a mistake. So the same themes do come up, but we try and keep it fresh. And there are lots of different ways for things to go. So yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so changing direction a little bit. You mentioned earlier your book, How to Make the World Add Up. And I'd quite like to enter into a more detailed discussion of statistics, maybe based on that book and your work on the show more or less as well. So do you ultimately agree with the old adage, lies, damned lies, and statistics?
Well, I don't, and I think it was important to push back against that. The beginning of How to Make the World Add Up starts with the story of Darrell Huff, who was the journalist who wrote the book How to Lie with Statistics, which is, I think, often thought to be the best-selling book about statistics ever written. And it is a good book. It's fun and it's informative. It's cleverly done, but it actually goes to a very dark place. What that book leads you towards is the idea that there is no truth out there, really. It's always lies. There is nothing you can do with statistics but mislead people, whether you're trying to win an election or whether you're trying to sell toothpaste. It's all just lies. And that's not right. Clearly, there are things about the world, there are truths about the world that we can only perceive using statistics. And I really wanted to emphasize that point. It turns out Darrell Huff ended up, the author of How to Lie with Statistics, ended up being tangled up with the effort funded by the tobacco companies to basically cast doubt on the science linking smoking cigarettes and cancer. And you can say all kinds of things that sound very wise about, well, we need more research and it's uncertain and experts disagree, and all of which are true, but cumulatively have the effect of leading people who don't want to stop smoking because they'd rather not believe their habit is killing them, leading them to the place where they go, well, it all sounds very confusing. The experts don't really seem to understand it. I guess I'll keep on smoking. Darrell Huff was right at the heart of that. He even testified in front of Congress with a very cute story about, how he could statistically prove that storks delivered babies. I mean, it's very funny. There's an important statistical lesson there. But ultimately, he was being paid to cast doubt on scientists who were telling the truth, that the evidence suggested that smoking cigarettes will give you cancer. It's really important to tell that story because we've seen that play out again and again. It didn't stop with the tobacco industry. We saw it again with climate change. We've seen it with COVID denial. It seems to be a very, very powerful strain of misinformation to not just to try to get people to believe things that aren't true, but to get people to be excessively skeptical and to see reasons to doubt everywhere. So yeah, I really wanted to push back against that. I think the lies, damn lies, and statistics is a very, very corrosive idea. Yes, we should be skeptical. Yes, statistics can be used to tell lies. They are used to tell lies. But I mean, it's like saying, well, people can lie using words. Therefore, I will never read a book again. You're just cutting yourself off from a world of information that you could access. So yeah. Sorry, I feel quite strongly about this. I think what we're trying to do on more or less, and with and what I'm trying to do in How to Make the World Add Up, is to help people think clearly about the world. And part of thinking clearly about the world is spotting lies, but that's not the only part of thinking clearly about the world. It's not even, I would say it's not the most important part. There's a lot more to it than that. And there's so many things that we couldn't possibly discern without statistics. You can see that in the case of the pandemic. Think about all the data that's been gathered to tell us, first of all, oh, there is a new disease. It spreads between humans. It seems to disproportionately affect elderly people. It seems to have the following fatality rate. It's about this dangerous. It spreads about this fast. Who's got it? Who's most at risk? Where is it now? What are the effective treatments? How can we test an effective vaccine? These are all statistical questions. You haven't got a hope of answering any of these questions at all without statistics. And it's life or death stuff. And yet we take it for granted. And we say to ourselves, oh, well, it's all lies, damn lies, and statistics. And then when the numbers aren't there, we really miss them. You can see that in the case of the Excel spreadsheet error from, I think it was late September, where the details are slightly fuzzy, but there was some file formatting problem that meant that nearly 16,000 cases disappeared from the track and trace system. And economists have taken the data and tried to figure out what happened. And a lot of people died as a result of that. Probably, if I remember right, it was about 1,000 people. That's just a guess. We'll never know. We don't know who those people were. But just looking at what happened to case counts and the failure to follow up and to isolate because of that error, that killed people. The numbers really matter, and we should be taking them seriously. We should be grateful to the people who are gathering them, and we shouldn't just be focusing on them when something goes wrong.
Okay, so we need statistics then, but obviously we've got to be careful about how we approach statistics to make sure we aren't deceived by those statistical lies. How would you recommend we look at statistics to know when they're trying to deceive us, or even when we're accidentally misunderstanding them, and when these are actually just saying what we think they are?
Yeah, so the book gives people 10 rules for thinking clearly about statistics, and you probably don't have time for all 10. The one that I think surprises professional statisticians the most, and people don't expect to see it in a book about statistics, is the very first one. The very first one is to search your feelings. I know it's a Star Wars quote, but examine your own emotional reaction to the newspaper headline, to the social media claim, whatever it is that you're being presented with. So much of what we believe or disbelieve, we do so for emotional reasons, because they fit into a narrative, because they make us feel good, or they make us feel vindicated, or we reject them because they make us feel threatened. Our side is right, their side is wrong. A lot of emotional baggage going on when we evaluate anything, and that's true even for experts. So I think it's very important you can't ignore your emotions, you can't overcome your emotions, and it's perfectly valid to have emotions, but you should notice them before you immediately turn to your friend and point to the newspaper headline, or before you retweet on social media, before you tell somebody something you've heard. You just sit with it for 3 seconds and go, okay, what is my emotional reaction to this? How is this making me feel? And once you've noticed and are mindful of your emotional reaction, I think then you're in more of a position to turn back to the statistical claim and go, okay, what's actually being said? And then you can start asking some follow-up questions. Among the straightforward follow-up questions, again, possibly slightly unexpected, is what is actually being said? This is a claim about gun deaths in America. What's a gun death? How is that counted? Very often, claims about gun deaths tend to circulate after a mass shooting. And of course, there are a lot of mass shootings, but most gun deaths don't take mass shootings. And the majority of gun deaths are actually suicide, not homicide, in the United States. Which is not to say there isn't a problem. Clearly, there's an enormous problem. But we should be understanding what the problem is before we get sort of too carried away. So that's a question not about the number, but about what it is that the number is counting, what the definition is. Actually, over and over again, I see confusion about definitions leading to all kinds of misinterpretations. The maths is fine, the number's fine. It just doesn't mean what we think it means. And a third simple piece of advice, and then I'll stop, is to look for context. So take a step back and go, okay, what can I compare this number to help me understand it? So sometimes it'd be useful, the government's going to spend £50 billion on something. Okay, what £50 billion per person? The answer is it's a little bit less than £1,000 a person. That gives you a sense of what sort of chunk of cash that actually is. Or what's the number compared to what it was last year or 10 years ago? What's the number compared to other countries? I was just earlier this afternoon recording an item on more or less about drug death rates in Scotland. And the two really important pieces of context for that. If I remember rightly, it's about 290 drug deaths per million people in Scotland. Total of about 1,000, a little bit more than 1,000. That doesn't make any sense, that number, until you compare it to other comparable countries. So it's more than 3 times higher than Sweden, and Sweden's the next highest in Europe. It's more than 10 times the European Union average, and it's been going up in recent years. So that sort of information, okay, it's much higher than other places you might expect to be similar, and it's rising. And now I understand. Until you have that sort of context, you've got no idea what 290 deaths per million really means, and whether it's, obviously all of those deaths are tragedies for the individuals involved, for their friends, for their families, but is that a big number or not? I don't know until you give me the context. So, and the thing is, these questions are not that hard. It's not that hard to find out the answer. It's often a little bit of work with the calculator. I say a bit of work, like a second with a calculator, and everyone's got a calculator on their computer and on their phone. A Google search, that sort of thing, will give you the context you need to really make sense of the numbers. It's not, doesn't involve a huge amount of statistical expertise. We can all do it if we're motivated, if we're interested, if we're curious, if we want to, we can all do it.
So we've been accused of being in a post-truth world, particularly with regards to statistics, like, for example, the £350 million a week claim way back in 2016. For you, is it improved statistical understanding, like the sort of exercises suggested in your books and maybe in More or Less as well, that is our way out of this post-truth world?
I would say in a post-trust world, actually. I can't remember, that's not my phrase, and I can't remember whose phrase it is. But the problem that we face, I think, is that most people are very distrustful of a lot of different data sources that we perhaps should be more trustful of. So a lot of this is about institutions figuring out how to earn the trust of individual citizens. How can we be, there's no way to be trusted. You can be trustworthy and hope that if you're trustworthy, the trust will come. So that is, I think, part of the problem to address. And that I discuss in the book ways in which we can increase the trustworthiness of the claims that we make and give people more reasons to trust us and to trust us for good reasons, rather than trust us because they do so blindly out of some kind of loyalty. Does More or Less do any good? Does How to Make the World Add Up do any good? I think it helps a bit. We can't do anything unless people want to know the truth. People are motivated to know the truth rather than motivated by, say, political partisanship because they want to win some kind of argument. There are an enormous number of resources out there to help people. And that's why I emphasize the sort of the emotional skills and the habits of mind and the curiosity and the searching for context, as much as I emphasize any technical skill about, how to calculate a margin of error. I don't think that really does most people much good. But understanding that there might be different ways to measure something, and it might be interesting to take a look at a particular question from a couple of different perspectives, the different measures, that sort of skill, I think, is really useful.
Brilliant. Okay, so the final topic I'd like to discuss with you is the topical topic of coronavirus. So you've written quite a lot about the pandemic, particularly in your column in the Financial Times. So I'm going to open this line of questioning just by a very broad question, and that's, do you think our government has taken the right approach to dealing with the pandemic?
I mean, it's a very big question and lots of different parts to it. I think some parts of government have done very well. I think the Office for National Statistics, for example, has done a very good job in gathering relevant data quickly. I think the efforts to procure vaccines have gone very well. We got a lot of different vaccines on order. We took some calculated gambles, and they've paid off, I think, very well. Other parts get a mixed grade. So testing was poor initially, very successfully ramped up. The tracing system never seemed to function well. It's not clear why. And then there is a big general problem of making difficult decisions too late, which we've seen over and over again. And I think it's probably reasonable to say that half as many people might have died if the government had locked down a week earlier in March. We'll never know. It seems a strange thing to say about a decision that may cost 20 or 30,000 people's lives, but I can't blame them for that because it all happened so fast. It was so unprecedented. Nobody really knew what the appropriate thing to do was. But it's much harder to understand, for example, the decision to close schools having 24 hours, less than 24 hours after opening schools. And you had 2 weeks to think about it. Sage, I think, recommended, I'll get the precise date wrong, but Sage advised keeping schools closed, I think, in mid-December, about the 18th. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but it's been a while. And the government said, no, we're going to keep them open. We'll keep them open. We'll keep them open. On Sunday, the day before they're due to open, said, we're going to keep them open. Send your kids to school. On Monday afternoon, started leaking to the press that they were going to close them again. That is hard to understand. Mm-hmm. I mean, really, that sort of decision making is yeah. I actually don't. I'm perplexed. I'm too puzzled even to be angry about that. I don't get it. So it's a mixed bag. The overall, in the end, you've got to judge the government by results, and the UK has had so far, I think, one of the very worst death rates, death tolls relative to the population of anywhere in the world. Not the worst, but up there. And part of that's bad luck. But part of that you have to ask, couldn't we have done better? Look at what Korea did. Look at what Germany did. Yeah, others have done a better job, and we should be asking ourselves that. I think Gavin Williamson announced that we'd done well on vaccines because we're the very best country in the world and we're better than all the other countries. Yeah, I mean, if he thinks that about the vaccines, there's a sort of strange amount of cognitive dissonance going on with what do you make of the other parts of the British response? So yeah, I mean, in the end, I'm not a political person, so what interests me is what's gone well, what's gone badly, and what can we learn. It is worrying that we don't seem to have learned quite as much as we might have done from what happened in March 2020. But these are genuinely hard problems. They really are difficult. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be making the decisions.
Mm. Okay, so if for you looking back, the picture seems at least a little bleak. Looking forwards, do you see it being any brighter? I mean, particularly with the vaccine rollout, what sort of challenges do you see there? Do you see us maybe moving towards normality?
The first column I wrote about the vaccine was explaining that it was kind of an course. all of the different obstacles we were going to have to get over. This was just after the first press release announcing this very, very effective Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. All the different ways things could go wrong, from vaccine hesitancy to the supply chains. I mean, the vaccines are incredibly difficult to make, to things like vials, adjuvants. There's a particular kind of oil that comes from a sort of rare tree in South America that Glaxo like to use in their vaccines, and all of these different things that could go wrong. So I don't want to be complacent. I can see a lot of potential for error. But that said, the UK has ordered a lot of vaccines. We should have a lot of doses coming through. And I think what a lot of people don't understand or haven't fully absorbed is just how much you get if you can protect the most vulnerable people. So if you can vaccinate about 5 million people, and that all the over 80s, all the care home residents, the NHS workers and the care home staff, more than 2/3 of all deaths so far have been from people that fit that description. So we're promised 2 million doses a week soon. So in principle, you could, and we've already vaccinated 1 million people, you could have all of those people vaccinated by mid-January with a first dose. And the first dose gives you some protection. You can have all of them fully vaccinated by Valentine's Day. And if they're getting the Pfizer vaccine, 95% effectiveness. So that already is dramatically reducing the death rate if you can do that. Then of course there is the fact that the more people get vaccinated, the more pressure you put on the R number. Change in transmission will start to be broken. We don't know how effective that will be. We don't know quite how effective the vaccines are at preventing transmission. It looks promising, but it's not been the main thing that the clinical trials have investigated. And of course, we still don't fully understand this new variant. But I guess what I'm saying is, if you're looking and you're going, oh, we've only vaccinated 1 million people in a month. There are 67 million people in the country. That's 5 years. This is never going to end. I think there's a lot of reasons to believe that we could see quite a lot of progress quite quickly. And Boris Johnson was talking about mid-February, vaccinate everyone over the age of 70. That seems a bit optimistic, but even if we didn't get quite that far, there is potential to see some really big gains. So I'm hopeful.
That's really good.
But I'm going to be waiting a long time for my vaccine, and you're going to be waiting even longer. But we are not. I mean, I'm nearly 50, and almost everybody who's died is older than me. I mean, there are other things. COVID can cause other conditions beyond death, serious conditions. But we can make a lot of progress towards protecting the most vulnerable people, and we will see the benefits. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon.
Brilliant. So maybe a brighter future ahead. So we're a little bit over time, but I'd like to ask just one final question on this topic. Mm-hmm. And that's, so seeing the coronavirus pandemic more generally, maybe seeing it through the eyes of one of your cautionary tales, what can we learn from this whole ordeal?
I was really struck by my own reaction. I had all of the information I think I needed to see what was going to happen by mid-February 2020. I'd spoken to a couple of epidemiologists. They called it absolutely right. Natalie McDermott came on, more or less, and she got everything basically right. How dangerous it was, not too dangerous, but dangerous enough. How fast it spread. I could do the maths, and you were like, oh, okay, this could be like, 300, 400,000 people in the UK could die of this thing, and we'll all get it. I knew that 11 months ago. And yet the gap between knowing understanding a threat and actually doing something, saying, I should sell my shares, I should buy some toilet paper, I should get a webcam, etc. I didn't do any of those things. And so for me, the lesson I'm going to learn is it's really important to look at the data, to look at the world, to read the academic literature, to try to understand things. But there is then a gap between understanding, which is a good first step, and actually putting something into action. The wisdom of acting on what you've understood. I'm going to have to get that right in future. I suspect it's going to be a persistent challenge for not just for me, but for everybody.
And hopefully we'll all get better at that. So unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but thank you very much for your time and thank you very much for your answers.